I really want to thank Franco and everyone who organized this event. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. The Lit Lab has meant a lot for me, both in the sense that I've learned a lot from it specifically and more generally as an encouragement to take risks and try new things, both in graduate education, the organization of graduate education, and in research. And it's also a real pleasure to be addressing this group, an ideal group in so many ways, and particularly for what I want to say today, because the disciplinary range of people gathered here quietly establishes, something I want to take as my jumping off point today, which is that the exciting things happening under the rubric of digital humanities often have less to do with digital technology as such than with the opening of new conversations between disciplines. Interdisciplinarity, of course, is not a new thing, but I think there is something new about the conversation taking place now between literary history and quantitative disciplines. In the past, we've often borrowed terms from linguistics or sociology, habitus, or what have you. But as Jim English has pointed out, literary scholars have only rarely borrowed the quantitative aspects of other disciplines' methods. That is beginning to change. And the way I would frame our situation in literary studies right now is to say that we're already beyond the point where we need to argue for giving quantitative methods a try, and reaching the point where we need to discuss how we intend to handle their success. Because it's already clear that these methods could be successful enough in literary history to pose real questions about disciplinary boundaries. They are not turning out to be methodological supplements that are easily contained in existing practice. For instance, a simple way to put it, 20 years ago, I thought we understood the broad outlines of literary history. We were going to add details and argue over their interpretation, but Romanticism, realism, modernism, we could see the shape of the picture. Today, I'm honestly much less sure about that. As we back up to look at more texts, we keep stumbling over long-term trends that don't really align with the periods or even conceptual categories we've used to organize literary history. You can find several in the publications of the Lit Lab, and I think I saw a new one on the screen a moment ago. Canon archive is a pretty interesting distinction to model. It's beginning to seem like there are basically new objects of study here, which is, of course, exciting. But the newness of these objects also pushes on the boundaries of literary study, because we are a discipline that is mostly sought to describe things a reader could experience. We write about authors, genres, period styles, tropes, characters. We may explain those things by invoking unseen historical forces, but our explanations have had disciplinary meaning insofar as we were, in the end, talking about things a reader could see. In this context, the success of distant reading is problematic. If you mine thousands of volumes, it turns out you can reveal patterns that readers haven't experienced because they only become visible on a scale we don't ordinarily inhabit. But objects of that kind are anomalous for literary study, and I think it's going to prove hard to address them while remaining strictly within the disciplinary boundaries of literary study. If we try to do that, one temptation, for instance, may be to force a mapping between observed patterns and our received critical vocabulary. It's possible to spend a lot of time debating whether we're seeing the emergence of a new style, or a new genre, or a new mode, or discourse, when it could easily be more than one of those things or none of them. It's altogether possible that we're seeing patterns on this new scale for which we don't yet have good names. I think we could save ourselves decades of semantic debate if we acknowledged up front that the nature of literary historical explanation may change as you scale up to thousands of volumes. It becomes more like social science in the sense that we're not always going to be describing known entities, periods or genres. Instead, we may have to proceed in a more agnostic way than we're used to. I don't mean that literary history as a whole needs to become a social science. I'm just suggesting that when we attempt to describe large and unfamiliar patterns, we may find it useful to move back and forth between historical practices of description, where you usually have some known object to describe, and social scientific practices of modeling, where you observe a relationship between variables and may not know what to call it yet. My title is Pikettys Model, and I'm sorry I'm going to mispronounce his name throughout this probably, because I think Thomas Piketty is demonstrating what it might look like to combine those practices. and demonstrating, incidentally, that influence can flow in both directions between the humanities and social sciences. Piketty is explicitly pushing economics toward historical description by insisting on the specificity of times and places. Abstract models based on 20th century data won't necessarily work for 19th century economies. For the same reason, he's pulling examples from Austin and Balzac to illustrate the specificity of 19th century social life. But he is also, of course, still framing quantitative models. He doesn't assume that the economic significance of history will be contained in concepts that are familiar to us from experience. Variables have to be measured, and the relations have to be modeled. So the primary thing I want to draw from Piketty are some methodological premises that I'm going to collect through the course of this talk. The first one being that we don't have to start from familiar critical concepts. We can start by modeling observations. Now, Hoyt Long, Richard So, and I recently collaborated on a Slate article that corrects one of Piketty's small mistakes about literary history, or what we believe to be a mistake. But the point of that article, as I understood it, was not to criticize the economist, but to suggest that our discipline can meet him halfway, borrowing certain aspects of social scientific methodology, just as he's borrowed aspects of history and literary history. I'm going to expand on the Slate piece a bit today because it works well, I think, as an example of the place where distant reading overlaps with the methods of social science. In doing that, accountability may get a little blurry because I'm building on collaborative research I did with Hoyt and Richard, but using it in this talk to support a methodological argument that they haven't necessarily signed off on. So please understand basically that they deserve credit for the research, but not necessarily blame for my interpretation of it. In any case, the small mistake Piketty made was to say that money disappears from 20th century literature, which may not sound like a small claim, but I mean that it's not essential to his argument. In fact, he seems to think that the disappearance of money is already widely acknowledged, and he invokes it merely, as it were, to show that his thesis is capable of explaining something we already know about literary history, which is that references to money, omnipresent in the literatures of all countries before 1914, virtually disappeared from literature after the First World War, at least in the form of specific amounts. I'm not sure what tradition in French criticism might explain this assumption, but in Anglo-American criticism, it's true. We often imply that the economic dimension of life, so prominent in 19th century realism, was displaced or disavowed in the 20th century. You can find people like John Vernon who put that very bluntly, saying fewer novels about money have been written in this century. But in a looser sense, even say Frederick Jameson's writing about modernism does imply that 20th century fiction holds economic life at an increasing distance. Now, Jameson, of course, understands economic life as a structure of social relations that money merely reifies. Being an economist, Piketty is more interested in the mediating role of money. And he's inclined to think that monetary changes can in themselves have cultural effects. So, for instance, he explains the disappearance, hypothetical disappearance, of specific sums of money from literature by pointing to inflation. In the rapid inflation that characterized the first half of the 20th century, he reasons, references to specific sums would have dated too rapidly to be useful as social reference points. So maybe novelists simply left them out. The first thing Hoyt, Richard, and I did was to show that the evidence Piketty thinks he's explaining doesn't actually exist. Specific sums of money don't vanish from literature after World War I. At any rate, they don't vanish from English language fiction. And since Piketty offers this as a sweeping claim about world literature, English language fiction is a significant counterexample. To test this, we organized 7,700 volumes of fiction drawn from a variety of sources, including some works in translation, and counted references to specific amounts of money. Now, this is a place where it would be easy to burrow deep into the weeds. For instance, what counts as fiction and how did we gather these volumes, which are important questions, but if I tried to answer them, it would take a long time. So I'm going to defer that to discussion. What I do have to talk about, at least, is what counts as a reference to a specific sum of money. And briefly, we included prices written out in Arabic numerals, currency terms like shillings or francs or quid, and phrases like 10,000 a year, where currency units are left implicit. There are also a range of ways you could count these things, including sophisticated natural language processing. And we did some of that. We used some machine learning to filter our selections. But for the most part, we relied simply on keywords and regular expressions for identifying snippets to pull. Then we manually sampled. We had some 250,000 snippets, and we manually sampled them because, of course, there are a lot of pounds and sovereigns and crowns in the world that are not currency, right? So you have to manually sample and make sure what the error rate is in different periods, what the false positive rate is. But really, this is not a very sophisticated methodology we're using. It's a simple methodology. And I don't want to dwell on it too long. The picture we got is, very briefly, that references to money don't disappear. Different assumptions might produce a slightly different contour here, a slightly different trend line. We tried it actually several different ways. Never did we see anything like the disappearance Piketty describes. So, okay, an economist is wrong about literary history, and maybe, less certainly, some things that literary scholars have said about the disappearance of money in the early 20th century are at least doubtful. Maybe they're based on hasty assumptions. But really, why should we care about this? We're not interested just in disagreeing with Piketty about literary history. The sheer frequency of money may be interesting, but I think only slightly interesting. You can see from the examples that I've chosen to plot that there is an association with realism. Gothic novels don't mention sums of money because they don't have to. They're often in a remote social context. Balzac and George Eliot mention it a lot as part of their commitment to social detail. But again, this is something we probably could or should have known. We might not have known that that trend increases into the 20th century, but only slightly interesting, I think. What starts to be more interesting is to ask, why would Piketty and perhaps literary critics get this wrong? Why would he and others believe that money was disappearing from fiction when it wasn't? One explanation might be that the canon in the early 20th century is unrepresentative, and you'll think that by looking at the Fitzgerald point. But actually, there are some canonical novels where money, specific sums of money, are mentioned a lot. So I'm not actually certain that it's simply a question of representativeness. It occurred to several of us that references to money in 20th century literature might have seemed less weighty or less memorable because they were playing a different social or narrative role. So since we had already sampled 250,000 passages about specific sums of money, it occurred to us that it would be simple to look at them and see what social role money was actually playing in these passages. Of course, we could have gone in a higher tech direction here. Topic modeling could be used to explore the economic dimension of models in a less narrow, less supervised way, and could reveal all kinds of things, by the way, that aren't specific sums of money. That's just a lead we're taking from Piketty. If you wanted to explore discourses of luxury, discourses of speculation, you could do that using topic modeling. And in fact, we did topic model our collection of novels in the early going as an exploratory heuristic to see the lay of the land, what's going on here, and what are the topics about money. But in the final analysis, we decided that it would be more useful to focus on a very specific rhetorical gesture, those moments in fiction where money is actually counted. And to explore that sort of well-defined rhetorical gesture, we didn't actually need very computational methods. We could do it with the traditional methods of, frankly, quantitative sociology. Sample passages, read them, and describe them according to a categorization agreed upon in advance. And those social scientific methods can be very flexible. I'm talking about money, which happens to be something you can count. And so we did record the amounts of money mentioned, but we also recorded social context. What's happening in each passage? Is this a bet, a gift, an inheritance, a debt? That turned out to be important, and it's something you could do with a wide range of themes, slavery or references to sexuality in fiction. What's important here rather is really the scale of the collection rather than, in this particular project, computational methods or algorithms. But money does come in amounts, so let me start there. How do amounts of money change in these 200 years of fiction that we're looking at? Unfortunately, money is distributed very unequally, both in real life and in fiction. And that makes it important to reflect a bit about what you're measuring. If you simply plot the face value of individual references, this is what you get. About 8 visible data points, which are huge, multi-million sums. I think one 20th century work of fiction mentions that an airport is being built for $40 million. They're very unrepresentative of the scale of reference to economic life in most fiction, which is all contained, oh, I shouldn't use my fingers, is all contained in this black line at the bottom of the page, right? What we really want to know is what's the typical scale of reference to money in fiction, and how does that change over time? And for that also, an average in the sense of a mean really isn't what you want. If you add up all these values and divide them by the number of data points, what you will get is completely dominated by those outliers at the top, which are huge. So statisticians will tell you what's better is a median, which basically is you organize all the values in a sequence and take the middle one. And that would actually work just fine for this project. There's some peculiarities of it that you can already see. They're strangely squarish, but you do see that there's a downward trend in the median. Now, the reason things are squarish here, of course, is because novelists, like all of us, like to mention round numbers, and there are a lot of 10-pound notes in the world. So I should mention, by the way, we've already converted francs and dollars and other currencies that occurred to pounds using historical exchange rates. But still, the number of references to 10 pounds is kind of dominating that plateau. There are a lot of those references, so if you take the median, it's likely to fall somewhere in that large group. So if you want a slightly more flexible measure, you could do what's called an interquartile mean, which is basically throw out the outliers at the top quartile, top 25%, and the ones at the bottom, and then actually add up and average the middle 50%. And that looks a lot like the median, but it's a little more flexible and it doesn't get caught on those round numbers in the same way. So this is a pretty good reflection of the face value of money, the nominal value of money in fiction from 1750 to 1950. But you shouldn't, I think, we shouldn't be too interested in all the little fluctuations in this graph, because the fluctuations aren't that interesting. And it's not even that interesting that there's a downward trend here by a factor of 4 or 5. Because what should really interest us is that there's not an upward trend. Because there was, after all, inflation in this period. If we were talking about fictional references to the same things, the prices of coats or a day's wages, we would see a 5-fold increase from 1750 to 1950. And the fact that there's not an increase is really what's striking. So a better way to represent this would be to take the interquartile mean reference to money for fiction in each 25-year period. I'm taking a 25-year moving window on all these graphs and taking the interquartile mean for that 25-year around each data point. And then divide it by the prevailing wage in that year so that we have a reference to some real thing. So we see the sort of social scale of economic description in fiction. And this is what you get if you do that, using time series of wages from economic history. So it's really quite a dramatic decline of about 25-fold from 1750 to the early 20th century in terms of the real value of the money mentioned in fiction. But now's where I get to the point where I have to admit something important, which is that this whole way of thinking about money is anomalous for literary criticism. And I think for ordinary readers, too. We don't normally think about money as something that's contained in references. We normally think about it in a more mimetic realist way as something possessed by characters. And we're interested in the real amounts of money they possess, not the amounts of money they mention as a rhetorical gesture. It's quite possible to have wealthy characters in, say, Trollope, who may only mention money when they go to buy postage. Right? So this has no necessary relation to the amount of money in novels. We're rather looking at a rhetorical dimension of fiction, a kind of typical scale of economic granularity in the way money is described. But frankly, what even is that? If this is an anomalous quantity, an anomalous angle of description for literary study, I'm very likely to be confronted by critics who just doubt that this is a meaningful or important trend. So I think I have to admit that in practice, I've started by saying that it's okay for us to describe phenomena rather than start from existing critical concepts. But in practice, we're going to have to relate those phenomena to some more familiar reference point. And that's the second thing I would want to acknowledge. We have to model their relation to some more familiar variable, something that we think we understand better. So what would be a range of possible explanations for this declining scale of economic reference in fiction? And actually, let me back up a little bit from that. I don't even want to promise you an explanation, because I've been talking about quantitative social science as a disciplinary model here. And one thing that I think quantitative social scientists know very well is that causality is a very hard problem, especially in human society. It's very difficult to distinguish the real causes from proximate factors that are mediating the influence of more remote causes. This is a really hard problem, and it's going to be even more difficult in this kind of humanistic data set where we really can't do experimental interventions into the 19th century. So I'm just going to promise description. And I think that itself is really necessary. I mean, I'm saying, what even is this trend? Because we really don't know that the trend even is a single coherent thing. It could be this. I'm going to back up a moment. This could easily be, pardon me, a silhouette produced by superimposing several different social causes. This doesn't have to be a single coherent object that we're describing. So part of the reason to model it and be careful in describing its relations to other things is that it might decompose into several other things. So let's consider some of the things that might be involved here and see how important they respectively are. And this is where my analogy to social science is going to get more concrete, because I'm actually going to try to model the relations between variables, starting with the declining scale of reference to money and considering a variety of other social variables. So one obvious thing would be we suspect that it's reasonably well known that fiction is written about a different range of social classes as the 19th century proceeds. And that would have a very obvious relation to the scale of monetary description. I've said that amounts of money in fiction don't necessarily have to be tied to the wealth of characters, but it seems likely that they are in some way. Or at least that's one of the things going on. So one way we could model that, you could actually go out and look at the wealth of individual characters and compare that to the way money is described in novels. But a simple proxy would be to look at genre, particularly in this period from the 1820s to the 1840s, when fiction is divided in part between Newgate novels written about the lives of famous criminals and Silver Fork fiction, which, as the name suggests, involves the lives of the fashionable. Not always wealthy, because these characters sometimes get into financial scrapes, but at least people coming from a different class. And if you take examples of those genres and then do to them basically what I've been doing to the 25-year moving window of passages describing specific sums of money, and take an interquartile mean for each volume of all the references to money in that volume, it's clear that Silver Fork novels typically refer to larger amounts of money than Newgate novels. And it's not surprising, really, that Oliver Twist would refer to smaller amounts of money than a novel of fashionable life. But it's nice to know that for sure. And if you do a t-test on the difference between these two samples, you can confirm that, yeah, there's a significant difference between these means. I should say this isn't exactly an again, shouldn't use my hands pointing to the line. It's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, because we're comparing individual volumes to a trend line that really is a trend line selected from all volumes, not aggregated at the volume level. It's a subtle point, but it's not quite an apples to apples comparison between that line and the dots. So in any event, we have one factor here. We have one descriptive variable that we can use to understand what's going on in that anomalous trend. And I think that's a step forward, but that doesn't have to be the whole story. As I mentioned, the social context of reference to money could be a really important variable here, at least as important as the people being described. Because, for instance, a commodity price is likely to be much smaller than an estate or an inheritance. So if money is being mentioned, for instance, mostly to describe daily wages or prices, that's going to lead to a different scale of reference in the aggregate. And in fact, when you look at the social contexts of reference to money across time, you do see very strong and clear patterns and long-term patterns in the social context. So, these are wages, not necessarily daily wages, but any reference to money paid as a wage. We counted here, and it's increasing from basically 0 in the 18th century. That probably has an effect. This is a less clearly marked trend, but references to inheritance decline. Maybe most importantly, because this is one of the largest categories in the data set, we're talking slightly less than 1,000 individual passages that we categorize by hand. References to prices, commodity prices of solid goods rather than, say, services or bounties paid for thief catching or something, but tangible commodities increase quite a lot, and they're a big portion of the data set, and they are smaller in size than most of the other categories. So this could have a lot to do with bringing down the typical scale of reference to money. And one of the things I want to draw our attention to here, that's another one of these methodological, I don't know if premise is quite the word here, but inferences that I'm inclined to draw from this kind of work. You'll notice this is it goes up and down. This is not a huge sample and there's some noise, but on the whole, all the trends we've been looking at, they're not too badly represented by a linear trend across 200 years. And there's something a little surprising about that. I think we do know that consumption and price play a larger role in late 19th century fiction than they had before, because people like Rachel Bowlby have written books about it. But I'm not sure that we've understood that as quite such a long-term trend. There are a lot of those books are written about the later 19th century and talk about the rise of consumer society as a late 19th century phenomenon, which is not false. I mean, it is rising in the late 19th century, and there may even, if we modeled this more subtly, it may even accelerate in the late 19th century. But it's also true that we're talking about a longer trend, and that the increasing importance of commodity prices in fiction could be understood in a really long time scale. So this is illustrating, again, what I began by observing, that we're often running into, as we back up to look at things at a scale, we're running into patterns, trends, call them what you will, that don't necessarily line up with concepts like late 19th century consumer culture or even realism. I mean, right, if the number of references to money continues from, Balzac and George Eliot into the early 20th century, we're having problems with our periodization. And that's a recurring experience for me, at least, and I think in a lot of other work that I'm seeing. So I would add a third and final methodological premise to my set of suggestions for a way to proceed, which is that we want to start with observations, or we can start with observations. You can start with familiar concepts too, but I think it's allowable to start by modeling observations. Try to relate them to familiar concepts, but keep in mind that some of the concepts we're working with, for instance, period concepts, may not have as much explanatory value as we're used to assuming. So it would be a mistake to assume that we have to explain the things we're seeing in terms of, say, late 19th century consumer culture, when there might be a larger object to be described. Okay, one final descriptive dimension of money, and particularly of the declining scale of description that I want to consider. I've mentioned that one obvious explanation is that novels might be written about a different range of people. But another kind of plausible seeming, maybe even causal explanation would be that fiction gets written for a broader range of people. We know from long-standing work in print culture and book history that the prices of 19th century books declined, that working class literacy increased, and that novel readership expanded into a broader fraction of the working class. And it stands to reason that that might have an effect here, an effect that could be mediated through these first two causes. That might be one reason why a different range of people are certainly being described in fiction. But it wouldn't even necessarily have to be mediated that way. For instance, I've mentioned Silver Fork fiction. The characters get into economic scrapes, perhaps a little more, described with a little more sort of shilling and pence counting grittiness than is typical in the works of Austen. That might be possibly because those novels are appealing to a broader audience, even if they're still about the lives of people from the landed gentry. So audience and reception are factors that we would also want to consider. And I think kind of plausible ultimate explanations for the trend, if we were to go that far. It's what we suggested in the Slate article. You can actually test these things. You can't assume that a digital library is going to have a representative sample of works from addressed to different readers. I know that they don't. But we can identify subsets of the library, like dime novels or shilling shockers, that are sold cheaply precisely to reach a larger readership. And it's worth testing whether they have price right in their name, right? Do the dime novels, are they describing money in a different way than other kinds of fiction? Say, works randomly selected from HathiTrust, which is where we're getting a lot of these works and comes from large university and large public libraries. If we randomly select, we'll tend to get works that were bought by university libraries that are not dime novels. So we could compare those two. I've also been interested in works that got reviewed and works that didn't get reviewed at the time by, for instance, publications like the Fortnightly Review or The Atlantic that have some intellectual prestige or at least pretensions. Are those a significantly different set? Do they have a different scale of social description, economic description? And the answer so far is no, that I'm not getting significant result here, and I'm showing it partly just in order to, it has a nice rhetorical effect to say sometimes you don't see a pattern, and that counts too. The different colors here are, a small, right now actually a pretty small sample of dime novels, randomly selected novels from the same date range. We're looking mostly at the late 19th century here, centering on the 1890s, and a selection of works that were reviewed in prestigious journals, reviews. But there's no discernible statistical pattern here yet, which isn't to say that we might not see a result if we expanded the sample a bit. You already saw in that Canon archive slide that pretty interesting results are obtainable by comparing subsets of works that have had a different kind of reception. And I'm also beginning to get some interesting results comparing 19th century works that were or were not reviewed by certain journals at the time. There are long-term sort of stable patterns that you can see, but I don't happen to see those here yet. And actually, one thing I think that's worth, the sort of negative result here is worth mention, partly because we're starting to get at the possible initial assumption for why Piketty might have been wrong, which is that our canon is unrepresentative of the broader world of fiction published and read, which is an argument that is often taken as the primary or only argument to do whatever you want to call this, text mining, distant reading. And it is, I think, one argument to do it. You do find cases where the set of works we're talking about is significantly unrepresentative of the broader universe of print culture. But it's not the only reason to do that. And actually, I think a lot of the leverage we're gaining is sometimes not even from questions of representation. For instance, here, there's really not a huge difference that we're seeing, at least with this sample size, between these different categories. You could say the reviewed are likely to become more canonical. They aren't yet canonical, but they're likely to become it. That may not in itself explain the differences we're seeing. And what we're really gaining here is not just from expanding synchronic representation away from the canon, but also importantly from expanding the diachronic scope of description. When you do that, you may see that the categories we're using are like glimpses, the classic glimpse of one part of an elephant. There's a bigger object there that you haven't completely described. And that's not just about representativeness, although I think these kinds of divisions between canon and archive or reviewed and non-reviewed are a very interesting place to keep keep working and keep looking. So what does all this amount to? Let me draw it to a conclusion. I'm not claiming to reveal a deep or fundamental truth about economic history or the economic history of the novel, just a dimension of economic rhetoric in fiction. But given the magnitude of the trend, this isn't an entirely trivial part of literary history either. The long slide from he has 10,000 a year to grubby description of nickels and dimes and farthings is a significant part of the history of the novel. Statistical models may not give us yet a complete causal explanation of the trend, but they help us understand at least what it consists of. For instance, it's interesting that there's a relationship to the rise of what gets called consumer culture. And I want to point out in conclusion that projects like this don't necessarily require intensely computational methods. Don't get me wrong, I'm not disavowing the high-end stuff. Probabilistic models are great, and I find them attractive. All that can be enormously useful and philosophically interesting, and I think more philosophically interesting than most humanists realize. I'm on record as saying that. But in this particular project, we had a simpler target. What Hoyt and Richard and I did was assisted by computers, but it was for the most part actually fairly traditional social science. And the key here, in my personal view, was not a particular set of algorithms or even a particular unit of analysis, but actually what I would call a deliberate methodological looseness. As I've admitted, we didn't start with a well-formulated critical concept. We started with an unexplained trend in the data and tried to understand what it was by modeling it. I've talked about that approach as akin to social science, but maybe a less off-putting phrase in English departments where we think of quantitative social science and think that might include economists, and that's maybe a less off-putting phrase would be strategic agnosticism. In literary studies, we've spent a long time arguing about the right way to frame questions, in part perhaps because we've often been describing the same subset of well-known texts, and the interpretive frameworks we applied to them were what differentiated our articles. As we back up into distant reading, I think the polemical habits honed in that earlier period may not always continue to serve us well. First of all, because we're no longer in an economy of scarce data. There are probably more large patterns to be observed than there are researchers to interpret or even describe them. So arguments about interpretive frameworks at this stage of the game may be unnecessary and also perhaps premature, because the other thing is we probably don't yet know what the appropriate interpretive frameworks will be for this new terrain. These are different kinds of patterns than we're used to describing. So I think we may need a methodology that is relatively agnostic and open-ended. Relatively, no methodology is perfectly open-ended. There are premises. That's why I've been drawn to social scientific practices of statistical modeling. They allow us to explore the relations between phenomena, even if we're not yet sure what the organizing concepts or causal explanations are. Thanks.